Espero que hàgiu dinat a gust i que les persones que han pogut visitar l'Hospital de Sant Pau hagin pogut realment copsar el que és capaç de fer la iniciativa privada a la ciutat de Barcelona i a Catalunya en general. La gran donació, la gran inversió feta per una sola persona, quan es va acabar la inversió, doncs la resta de l'obra va ser molt més senzilla, però el que veiem de l'obra monumental, òbviament, és una joia i estem molt contents de poder ser rebuts en aquest recinte. Em toca, un gran honor, presentar el professor Makoni, que va estudiar anglès i lingüística a la Universitat de Legon, al país de Ghana. Va fer el doctorat en lingüística aplicada
in applied linguistics from Edinburgh University in Scotland, and he's currently associate professor of applied linguistics and African studies at the Pennsylvania State University. He has published extensively in the areas of language, policies and planning, security, health, aging, and philosophies about language. He is the author of the book Black Linguistics, Language, Society and Politics in Africa and the Americas, and co-edited Disinventing and Reconstituting Languages and Language and Aging in Multilingual Contexts. He has published papers in a range of journals, including Language Policy, the International Journal of the Sociology of Language, Language and Communication, Language in Society, and the Journal of Multicultural Discourses. Professor Marconi tells me that the main objective of his presentation, entitled Human Linguistics, is to analyze African sociolinguistic scenarios using the concept of human linguistics developed by Ingve, and in the study of human linguistics, language is not a thing that lives a life of its own outside and beyond human beings, but it has its true existence only in the individual, and all changes in the life of a language can only proceed from individual speakers. In the presentation, he will analyze, using this concept of human linguistics, the implications on language policy and planning and African sociolinguistics of 4 different ways of framing diversity. Linguistic diversity as enumerability, the naming game, deconstructing indigeneity in African languages, and dictionaries as discourse theories about language. So let's welcome Professor Makoni.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I would like to thank the Linguapax people for giving me an opportunity to share some of my ideas with you concerning issues about linguistic diversity. There are always advantages and disadvantages of speaking towards the end of the afternoon. The disadvantage is that everybody will have said what you wanted to say, so there's nothing new that you can come up with. The advantage, though, is that you are able to get back and try and get people to refocus on some of the concepts that might have been raised, but which were not perhaps discussed thoroughly enough. In my presentation, what I'm going to try and fall asleep. In my presentation, is there a technician somewhere? In my presentation, I'm going to try and get back to discussions about what notions of indigeneity may mean when you construct those concepts within African colonial and post-colonial linguistics. I will also look at what the pros and cons of notions about endangerment. What exactly do we mean by endangering, right? And who is being endangered? I will also try and look at, I will then argue towards the end that perhaps what is required is a way of thinking in which what is central to our imagination is not so much language, but the users of those particular languages. That's fundamentally what my line of thinking is going to be. The young lady, can you help me? The problem is I can't get my PowerPoint.
It's blank.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay, right. So, what is human linguistics? That my primary objective is to explore the implications of adopting a human linguistic perspective on language planning. From such a language perspective, language is not a thing that lives a life of its own outside and above human beings, but it has existence only in the individual speaker. That is the sort of brief definition of what I would like to call, I wish I could get this. Sorry, I will get it right as we go, yeah. In a human linguistic perspective, it is people and the activities that they are engaged in which should be central to a study of language. So, from such a perspective, the primary goal of language planning in Africa will be to promote and change the political and economic status of people by enhancing the nature of communication between them. Right. So the human linguistic perspective shifts the focus, and you have central to your concerns individuals. Languages are important, but they are of secondary significance in the way human linguistic perceives issues about policy and planning. Enhancing communication between people is valuable because communication is always constitutes sub-tasks of non-linguistic tasks, and they typically interface naturally between different practical affairs. So the ultimate objective of language planning in such cases would be to create communicative context that would enhance people's abilities to improve their social welfare. Language cannot exist in splendid isolation. In a human linguistic perspective, the central issue here is that you need to avoid the notion of language users, because what is central here is the notion that it is individuals who are the centerpiece, and then you follow the acts that they are engaged in. Right. Right. Now, what are the implications of all this for when you look at human linguistics and then you look at African language planning policies and planning? One of the often reported failures in language planning policies is that African language policies fail because the material resources are not available. In this particular presentation, however, focusing on human linguistics, the assumption that the argument that I'm going to which I'm trying to make, is that it's not so much the material resources that are inadequate. Yes, that might be the case, but that we need to critically examine what are some of the assumptions, underlying notions about what constitutes language. I'm going to argue, drawing from human linguistics, that perhaps the failure of the policies in Africa arises in part from a tendency to treat African languages as if they were real objects, thus confusing two domains, the natural and the conceptual. That is the argument that I'm trying to make. If African languages are not entities in the real world, for language planning to succeed, it has to reorient itself away from assuming that it is dealing with real entities and to seek to enhance communication between people. If our conceptualizations of African languages are to change, I now revisit some of the work that we did previously. We have to disinvent the discourses which are typical of African languages, some of which overlap with the discussions that we have had this morning. In this disinvention discussion, I'm going to argue that there are at least 5 different issues that we need to be able to address. The first one is the issue of linguistic diversity as enumerability, the countability issue, the census issue. The second one is the naming game. The third one is the conceptualization of these African languages. How did they emerge? Why do we call them indigenous? What are the processes and procedures which were set in motion? And what were the discourses that brought them about? Then the fourth one is the construction of indigeneity. To what extent is indigeneity itself a colonial construct? Then the issue about dictionaries as discourses, dictionaries as theories of African languages. Basically simply meaning to what extent, what are the underlying ideologies about language which underpin notions about dictionaries. Right. All these, I think, are important if we're going to try and understand the discussions that we are making. Now, let me talk about this briefly. There's wide disagreement about how many African languages there are. And I guess even I guess there is also disagreement about the number of languages that there are in the world. The estimates vary substantially depending on who is supplying the figures and for what purposes. Whitley, for example, who has extensive experience dealing with certain parts of Africa, assigns 47 languages to Kenya. But as Njoroge points out, radically drops the number to 21 in the same publication. Williams, when he's writing about Zambia, for example, draws our attention to the fact that the number of languages assigned to Zambia seems to vary from 73 to 20, with one language dead, depending on who is writing. Other people with their minds, Morehouse, with his mind focused on the Pacific region, in an argument which clearly resonates with Africa, suggests that the lack of agreement on the number of languages does not reflect lack of ability to count or an inability to distinguish between communal languages, dialects, but perhaps the non-existence or the inappropriacy of a notion of language as constructed in a formal Western linguistics in non-Western contexts. Right. So the issue which is being made here is this, is that perhaps, right, since we will never agree completely how many languages that we're dealing with, the problem may be the underlying notion about language itself, right? That this concept that we are taking for granted, that it may be relevant to these non-Western concepts, we may need to demonstrate its validity. We may need to show how it emerged. Now, if you're going to work out and explore what we're calling here the census ideology, which means that the number of languages that there are differ depending on when that census took place and who was carrying out that census, you need to take into account or look into 4 different types of modalities. Cohen, when he was writing about India, identifies the following: historiographic modality, observational modality or travel modality, survey modality, and musicological modality. Then another type of discourse that is important for us, if we're going to try and make sense of what is taking place in terms of diversities around us, is what we can call the naming game. In the naming game, the important thing here is to show how notions that languages have names have emerged, and the impact the naming has on ways in which the African linguistic map has emerged and has been imagined. For example, what is important is that in the African context, we have what are called lingua names, which means that, let's say, the people who are Shona ethnically are supposed to speak Shona, the Zulu are supposed to speak Zulu, the Bambara speak Bambara, etc. Right. So the key thing there is this, is that you are assuming that you have these various objects and then you are assigning names to these particular objects. But alas, we know the following, that it is possible that the same speech variety may occur in a number of different countries and be given different names, right? So that complicates our attempt at counting. It complicates our census game, right? And we also know, for example, that in some cases, what we have are the same language variety being named differently. For example, you have, in Morocco, for example, you have, I'll remember the names of the two language varieties. The issue which is there in Morocco is that there are certain minority languages, for example, where the names which the speakers themselves give to their languages are different from the names that are given to those languages by those that are officially in power. Why is this all important? This is all important because, like we began to talk about, it is important when you're dealing with, at least with African scholarship, to know that African scholarship, whatever it is an heir to colonialism. right? That it is still trying to struggle to find ways of separating itself from the way it was defined originally by when the missionaries came and the early missionary colonialists and the generation of African scholars who came through. There's always a discrepancy in some of these cases between how the linguists themselves may refer to what is taking place and the names the users use to describe what is taking place. How do they define their own languages? Let me cite you an example from Pauline Gitte. Gitte, for example, cites two languages which are spoken in West Africa, Gwi and Wobe, which, according to him, can be categorized as distinct languages on some, in quotes, objective linguistic criteria, but are regarded by the same language speakers, right, as part of the same language. According to the speakers themselves, the fact that these two speech forms are separate is a definition of language which is a product of how white scholarship has emerged. This is not how they see themselves. From that perspective, names are therefore not merely descriptive, they are constitutive. Right. That you are trying to make the case that in any progress you are going to make in African scholarship, it is important to try and take into account how the African speakers themselves understand the situations themselves. What do they think is happening? What are their own inside views about the world? How do they understand the labels that have been assigned to them? This is important because it gets us into one of the key issues that has kept coming up in the discussion in the morning. That is the issue about indigeneity. What African scholarship in sociolinguistics has demonstrated is that the notion of indigeneity is not an innocent or simple one. For example, the scholar Mudimbe, in his The Invention of Africa, and subsequently in The Idea of Africa, argues compellingly that the idea of Africa was an invention, right? He argues that it was carried out through a deployment of a series of Eurocentric conceptual discourses, which were drawing both on Eurocentrism and Greek narratives, reinforced and consolidated through colonial and missionary discourses. Africa was therefore being imagined and embedded in foreign discourses. Right, let me put my flag very clear here. I am saying this. I am saying that the notion of indigenous African languages is alien to African concepts. It is a carryover, a legacy of colonial thought. Therefore, powerful arguments for the retention and use of African languages as media of instruction are a retrospective legitimation of colonial encounters. That is the position that I'm taking. In African studies, indigenous African linguistics have to be treated. We have to treat some of these concepts carefully, because we need to know why do I think that these concepts that I'm calling indigenous are alien. Let me try and explain to you how that happens. That the languages that are defined as indigenous in post-colonial Africa were first construed as inauthentic during the colonial era by the missionaries, their African assistants, colonial administrators, and local Africans themselves. For example, the Africans referred to the version of Shona which was used in the Zimbabwean educational system as Chibaba, meaning that Baba meaning father, priest, the language of the priests. The priests were even more candid, defining among themselves the varieties of language, some of them as the Jesuit language, according to the historian Ranger. Right. And this process continues. Now, this moves us on to the discussion, I think. Yeah, oh, okay, good. So, what do I mean? What I mean is this, is that the invention of African languages is unlike processes in language standardization. It is not a process of converting a linguistic continuum into discrete languages. This was a process of trying to convert linguistic materials into what you can call a perfect second language speech. Why do I call it perfect second language speech? Because the people who subsequently were to demonstrate or to be accorded expertise in those languages did not speak those languages as their first languages. Right. So African languages, to some extent in their genesis, right, those that were subsequently found their way into the written form do not have native speakers as their point of reference. Now, another process that is clearly that has been taking place quite frequently and widely in Africa at the moment is the notion of lexicography. The notion of dictionaries as discourse is unusual because it runs counter to assumptions about dictionaries and languages. Dictionaries are widely regarded as a type of list or listing whose organizational principles differ substantially from discourses in everyday life. The discrepancy recedes, however, if we define discourse here for African to refer to the practices that, to refer to the discourse practices of those particular communities which are under study. The development of lexicography in African applied linguistics has been driven, one, by Christianity, colonial expansion, anthropology, and more recently, linguistics and corpus linguistics. Because it was driven by Christianity, colonial expansion, and anthropology, it is impossible to avoid having to address issues about the role of political imperialism in the construction of dictionaries in Africa. The early dictionaries in the African cases were bilingual dictionaries, Zulu, Kefa dictionaries, English, Chiswana dictionaries, for example. Right. Those were the sort of early dictionaries. Right. Subsequently, more recently, some of these dictionaries have tended to be more monolingual dictionaries. So the shift has been to move from multilingual dictionaries to dictionaries that are more monolingual dictionaries. This is important because if the bilingual dictionaries were a product of colonial encounters, the monolingual dictionaries refer to a sense of African academic nationalism as it tries to control and determine the destiny of what it regards as its own languages. The dictionaries that we are talking about here were faced with a lot of problems. The problems at one very specific level, which I want to illustrate here, were that was one of trying to translate some of these categories. The problem ran like this. The notion of God or sin or spirit, I think, clearly illustrates this. It was not that the missionaries, for example, were seeking to find African words. What they were trying to do was to try and bend African words so that they can begin to at least take upon European meanings. So, for example, to find a word for God or sin or spirit in a local vernacular that did not do damage to the concept of God as understood by Christians was a powerful method the missionaries, and they had to think deeply about the spiritual ideas of those they hoped to change. So it was like this. They wanted to introduce the notion of God, sin, or spirit, right? So what you do is you use the ideas about spirit, etc., which exist within those particular languages, but you bend those views, you bend the vernaculars so that the vernaculars reflect the interests, will, and imperial interests of the colonial projects. In other words, the key thing which was there was how do you get a local vernacular to articulate the interests of the local, of the white missionaries as opposed to what? To the Africans themselves. Now, what is the way forward? The way forward here is through what I'm calling here a phenomenon called what? Called System D. In System D, the argument I'm making is that we're trying to postulate or to argue for a framework of language that allows individuals, that gives priority or that celebrates the importance of the capability of individuals to improvise, to innovate, and to be creative, right? You are interested in finding individuals who are self-motivated, resourceful, ingenious, and creative, so that the constraints that I've been trying to describe, the constraints of imperial power, the constraints of how a vernacular can be used to articulate and express alien interests can be overcome, right? And System D is a slang phrase which has got its roots in Francophone Africa and the Caribbean. And it fundamentally is useful in this case when one is trying to talk about how do Africans then move forward in such a case, because it gives you a sense of creativity, right? Individuals were able to work beyond were able to use whatever resources that they have got and to move beyond those resources. And for example, if you're going to be dealing with issues like in migration, for example, people moving from one place to the next, and they may not have all the necessary resources that they have got. System D then enables us, for example, to account for the capability to be able to function effectively even when you have got limited resources. And System D also enables us to account for the creativity that tends to take place when individuals find themselves all stuck in a small space and they are confronted with problems for which they have got they don't have any experience in handling. System D also enables us to come up with another important issue. It's one of the key aspects that is always talked about in African context, this sense of intense creativity, is that the System D view provides us with sites of intense creativity and innovation as speakers find unorthodox approaches to address their daily activities. This resourcefulness which takes place in informal economic examples spaces is an example of what we're calling a in System D, right? In system D, we shift from our main concern at the very beginning of the presentation with aspects about language to focusing more and more on individuals and to talk about what we call an individual sociolinguistic pilgrimage. And let me read the last PowerPoint because it captures what we are trying to do here. That each individual travels a unique sociolinguistic journey. Since no two individuals have got identical social trajectories, travel provides each person with social, cultural, and economic capital and is an important social index of adventures which can be analyzed over time. Integrationism may be an even more useful lens on language economics if it builds into its system a way of adopting a historical perspective that each layperson, each individual, because adventure is a particular form of migratory experience filled with risk-taking and quest for a new valorized identity through acts of intense experience. Thank you.
Moltíssimes gràcies per aquesta enorme defensa de la visió dels usuaris del llenguatge empoderats,
language users who are empowered, original, creative, which I think will take away some of the work of linguists, but will be stimulating also. So we have 10 minutes for questions or comments. I think that someone stood back there, but he's the person recording the video.
Thank you. That was very interesting tour d'horizon, I think, about some of the difficulties of an indigenous language encountering or being encountered by somebody else's religious tradition and what happens. But I have been thinking about some of the same data, but from a different point of view. You seem to think that what typically happens is that the missionaries come across an, quotes, indigenous language, find it doesn't quite express what they want to express, and so they change it to express what they want, and so it ends up, the language gets changed, but the faith remains the same. I was confronting various situations in the growth, both, say, of Buddhism and Christianity in Europe, Buddhism in India, say, and Christianity in Europe, where the change has gone the other way. So that, for example, in the growth of Buddhism and being spread in Central Asia in the first, second centuries AD, what a faith which was seen as a path. Was that the ruling metaphor was that Buddhism was a path to enlightenment. And because of various facts, it came to be seen as not a path, but as a vehicle, as a cart, which would take you. So obviously the metaphor was different. If you are on a path, then you are choosing to follow it, and you get there, or you don't. If it is a vehicle, then you jump on the vehicle, and it takes you without you having to do anything else. So in that sense, the metaphor of the faith was changed, and one can notice a particular possible pun in Sanskrit between jnana and jnana, which seems to account for this change. That was one. Another example we had of this is of the process of Christianity going into Germanic-speaking countries, such as the Frankland or whatever, where the metaphor was taken, that Christ, instead of being somehow a victim of the Roman Empire, was a warlord in his own right. And what you owe him is loyalty in the same way as you would, so that a believer would have a ground for loyalty to Christ, because Christ is your leader. He will lead you into struggle. And this is in some sense the opposite of how Christ had been seen hitherto. So all I'm saying is that it's quite possible that the so-called indigenous languages would change the faith, rather than the faith being used to change the indigenous languages.
Mm. That's interesting, because what that shows is that the nature of the relationship between the indigenous languages and the, let's say, their metaphors and Christianity, you may need to look at the specific site, in specific context, and find what the examples may lead you to say. Let me give you an interesting example. In African sociolinguistics, for example, when you want to have fun, one of the key debates that has been taking place over many years was, what is the name that we should use to refer to God or sin or something like that? What do we call this guy? I mean, do we say he's up in the sky, or do we say he's up somewhere hiding, whatever you want to put him? You see, because if you say he is up, he's hiding under the ground somewhere, that would be consistent with some African views about the end of life. But then your problem then would be that you now need to reconcile the idea that death to God is not ultimate, right, within the African context. It's simply one step moving forward, right? So you could argue that what the introduction of indigenous languages as ways of dealing with the spread of African language of Christianity did was to change Christianity, was to change the views of the Africans themselves who were acting as priests, right? That the people whose views were radically changed in all this were the Africans who were mediating between the priests, between the white missionaries and everybody else, you see. Because now they were part of two different worlds, and they came up with a completely different understanding of what was taking place. Right. That's another possible way of thinking about it.
Can I ask you a question in English? You said at the end of one of your slides that the invention of African languages is not drawing lines along the linguistic continuum. But what I would like to ask you is, if it is not that, what is it? Or perhaps I didn't understand what you said before.
I said the invention of African languages, basically the argument, I think what I was trying to say was that it is conceptually, I think, not accurate.
It was right at the end of one of the slides.
Well, one of these things.
Towards the end.
Towards the end.
Carry on.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not there.
It's not that one.
No.
But you see, this is the argument here, okay, that there are a number of different discourse modalities which are deployed in order to bring about these languages, okay, right? So that is the key argument. The key argument is that you need to understand how it is that they came about to create this, mm-hmm, right? And these languages were a product, to some extent, of all this put together, right? It is not like they conceptually were existing independent of the analytical categories, right? That is the argument that I'm trying to make here, right? That typically what you have, for example, when we talk about indigeneity, etc., is individuals existing primordially independent of anybody's encounter with them. But I'm saying that no, right? That it was partially a result of an intervention and the way they were written about. Right. The process of constructing of these particular indigenous languages is still also an ongoing one.
Okay, thank you very much. Em sembla que s'acaba el temps.
Well, I think that we've reached the end of the presentation. I would like to thank Professor Makoni for this stimulating presentation. It may seem that we're talking about ethnical issues, but Europeans are always Eurocentric, so it's very interesting to hear this call to leave this Eurocentric vision of the world behind and this vision of languages to better understand the world around us. So I would like to sincerely thank Professor Makoni, and we will take a 3-minute break to change to the next session. Thank you very much.